Welcome to this lecture on Hannah Arendt and the concept of the political. Sometimes I wonder if the most difficult concepts to really define or understand are those that in some ways are part of our ordinary language. But scholars and thinkers want to use them in a particular way, and that makes it difficult to interlink our ordinary concept with the scholarly concept. The political, the concept the political is one such term that I think is particularly difficult at times because it can often be confused with politics, which is not quite the same. And I had to struggle a long time before I had some sort of idea what the political might mean. And one of the thinkers that was a great help for me to understand the concept of the political was Hannah Arendt. And Arendt often works with very carefully defining a concept. She starts by defining and then wants to make a point for a particular argument. And the clarity of her definitions makes it very convincing. Her ideas makes it very convincing, to my mind at least, and then makes it take some effort to critique them. But of course, even if it's difficult to critique, doesn't mean that Hannah Arendt is always right or correct. But what I want to do here is to try to use Hannah Arendt to get an understanding of what the concept of the political might mean. So before we start with Arendt, or continue to Arendt, she was of course not the first one to use the concept of the political. We need to go back to 2000 years to Aristotle, at least, and the idea of the political comes from the Greek word polis, which means square, the common place where you meet. And one thing that is not so obvious is, even though it's obvious that she uses Aristotle and the Greek concept, one other thing that is not so obvious when it comes to the concept of the political is that, to my mind, she's also referring or referencing or critiquing another contemporary thinker to Arendt called Carl Schmitt. I will not enter into much details of either Aristotle or Schmitt, but I need to say something about their thoughts of the political in order for us to see where Arendt fits in. So firstly, Aristotle then, he argues that the polis, or the city, the square, or the town, should be based on equality. That free citizens, that is land-owning males, in the city should gather together and work out the concept of the good, capital G, together in like-mindedness. So in other words, for Aristotle, the basis for the political is that of friendship. It binds the community together, and it's the communal moral values that one can agree upon, that can also make you discuss what the common good is. Enmity, or enemies, are by definition those outside of the polis for Aristotle. So friendship and common moral value is within the polis, and it should enable the citizens to agree on actions against the enemy. So since moral virtues for Aristotle are universal, one can come into agreement with each other. So the virtue of every individual will then lead to a harmonious common state. So the love between friends or equal citizens forms the basis for the political. That is the discussion where the common good for the community can be worked out. The political is the place where the common good is worked out. And this is in stark contrast to the much later thinker Carl Schmitt, early 20th century. So Schmitt places the enemy within the political sphere. So in direct opposition to Aristotle. For Schmitt, the political is the place where the discussion of the common good takes place. It's the same as Aristotle, but in itself, it is defined by the distinction of friend and enemy. The enemy is an enemy within the political sphere. And you define your identity against what is perceived as the enemy within the political. So the goal, it might be agreement or consensus, but the way to reach the agreement will be filled with conflict for Schmitt. So it's these conflicts and your definition against the enemy within the political that defines the political, and not friendship or communality as it is in Aristotle. So in other words, it's not as if you have a political identity for Schmitt that you enter into a political discussion. Not beforehand. You don't have a political identity before you enter into the discussion. You are defined, or you reach your identity in interaction with your enemy within the political sphere. So, to make a link to Arendt already now, for Schmitt, where there is a common ground between Schmitt and Arendt, you need to enter into the world of the political in order to have an identity, or even to have existence for Arendt. And Schmitt does talk about friendship as well in the political sphere, but you will have to work out a common value together with those that you share the vision of the common good. And then you need to establish that good, but that will occur in relation to the enemies within the political sphere. So friendship is not primary for Schmitt. And if we enter into Arendt from this, it's important to remember or to know that Arendt saw herself as a philosopher up until the Second World War, but then she was awoken, or she couldn't. She felt compelled to enter into the political, to the world of actions and activities. So she stopped calling herself a philosopher, and instead she saw herself as a political thinker. And this comes down to what that Arendt is concerned with, the activity of humans. And the activity of humans, it's not of a single human, the individual. She's not concerned with the individual in the political. And I need to use some non-inclusive language here, because what a very famous quote by Arendt clarifies what she means with the political. She says, men, that is plural, men and not man, live on the earth and inhabit the world. So the most central concept in Arendt's thinking is precisely this, that human beings are distinct from each other and therefore make up a plurality. She has an idea that of humans sharing one nature, we are all humans, and it's fundamental to Arendt, but in what she calls the world where we live and have our being, that is made up by a plurality of distinct individuals. And she writes in the page called Introduction, paper called Introduction into Politics. You have read some pages of that in the course. And in the opening pages, she writes, human beings, in the true sense of the term, can exist only where there is a world. And there can be a world, in the true sense of the term, only where the plurality of the human race is more than a multiplication of single species. So what does this mean then? First of all, as Arendt sees it, every single person has a particular perspective. From one side, Arendt argues that there will never be a complete knowledge of the world. No single individual will have a complete knowledge of the world. This means that in order for there to be any sort of understanding of the world, there needs to be a plurality of perspectives. This doesn't lead her into relativity, but that's a different question. What Arendt talks about is that people groups, more than individuals, is that no one but you or the particular people group that you belong to have the perspective of the world that you carry or that you hold. So it will be a diminishing of the world if your perspective disappears. So if you kill someone, if you kill a people group, by effect, what you're also doing is that you kill something of your own world. You decrease your world, your space. So Hannah Arendt's argument against annihilation is interesting in this context, because the value of the human being and the prohibition against annihilation comes not from some sort of intrinsic essence or quality of human value in that sense, but from the fact that the death of human beings is a destruction of the human world. So Arendt writes with regards to annihilation in the text that you read, Introduction into Politics. She writes this: if a people or nation, or even just some specific human group, which offers a unique view of the world arising from its particular position in the world, a position that, however it came about, cannot readily be duplicated, is annihilated, it is not merely that a people or a nation or a given number of individuals perishes, but rather that a portion of our common world is destroyed, an aspect of the world that has revealed itself to us until now, but can never reveal itself again. Annihilation is therefore not just tantamount to the end of a world, it also takes its annihilator with it. So with Arendt's concept of the world, we can see two things. Firstly, we are fundamentally interlinked and interdependent upon each other for our existence in the world. The destruction of another person destroys something of the fabric of the world. And this calls for the need to construct a world that safeguards the existence of each other. In other words, the political needs to uphold human existence. Primary for Arendt. Secondly, in order to exist as a human person, you have to appear in the public. You have to enter into the world. In a very basic sense, you are, of course, a single individual for Arendt. You have a private space, but you need, in order to act, you need to do that in relation to someone else. So the second important thing with the idea of the world that links to the concept of the political is that the world should enable freedom. So upholding of human existence, and the world needs to enable freedom. To sum up, to finally say something about the political, we need to look at some fundamental concepts, namely freedom, because, as I said, freedom is a central idea for Arendt in order to understand what the political means, and also the idea of action or activity. So, to say something of the concept of the political with the help of the idea of freedom and some comments on activity as well. So you can only make yourself known by appearing in the world for Arendt. So in order to do that, we need to have space where debate is possible, where discussions are possible, and we need to discuss how the common world is to be structured so that humans are free to act. So Arendt goes back to ancient Greece and takes the idea of the polis, that is the square or the city-state, as an example. On the square, the polis, all heads of households, the so-called free men, entered as equals in their households. There were clear hierarchies. They were patria de familia. But you were not supposed to bring that hierarchy out onto the public square. So the domos, the home, is clearly separated for Arendt from the common square, the polis. And it's the square, the polis, that men can come together and decide how to structure the society so that there are equality between men, and that it could be safeguarded. And on the square you also need the freedom to act. And this is the political for Arendt, with references to Roman political structure that depends more upon contracts. The political is more the Greek concept of free human beings deciding upon how to structure a free society and be enabled to act accordingly. So the political in Arendt is how free human beings decide upon how to structure a free society. That enables one to act accordingly. So here actions is also key, or activity. And I come to that in just a bit. Because freedom is to strive in common to the freedom of acting. So action is not simply any activity that you can come up with, anything that you can do. Actions is for Arendt when human beings work in concert together in the public sphere. So this acting has a twofold consequence. Firstly, and most importantly, when we act, we practice our capacity to start something new. And I come to that very soon. Secondly, in terms of activity, the common action is the foundation for political power. So it has to do with starting something new, and also to the concept of power for Arendt with actions. For what will emerge when man act in concert, as Arendt phrases it, is power. Power for Arendt firmly belongs to the people. And here's a long discussion in another text of Arendt of the difference between power on the one hand and violence on the other hand. Violence is not to be equated with power for Arendt, because power can only come from men acting in concert. It belongs to the people. So the aim of power is therefore to do something new that can change the world and expand our notions of living in the world, and expand freedom to act in the world. So space is also important here. It's a concept that interlinks with the idea of freedom. Freedom is not exactly the freedom to choose between different options as in liberalism. Arendt is even noticeably critical against that type of freedom, of simply being able to choose between different options, particularly when economy gets involved in this. For that simply makes us into consumers. So we could probably have a sense of Arendt being a critic of neoliberalism and the consumer society. Very much against the consumer society, I would say. But neither is freedom simply free will, as it was developed by Augustine and within Christian theology. Because Arendt writes in her text, What is Freedom? She writes, freedom, moreover, is not only one among the many problems and phenomena of the political realm, properly speaking, such as justice or power or equality. Freedom, which only seldom in times of crisis or revolution becomes the direct aim of political action, is actually the reason that men live together in political organization at all. Freedom is the raison d'être of politics. The raison d'être of politics is freedom. So freedom for Arendt is very closely connected with our capacity to start and make something new. This is what Arendt calls natality, or birth. The reason why Arendt makes so much out of freedom, being the raison d'être, the very justification of the politics, is that making something new is the moment when we literally come to being in the world. That's why she calls it natality. Activity, making something new, is when we come to being into the world. And every time we act in this sense of making something new, then we reenact our birth, and therefore we come to being anew in the world. And what Arendt means with new here is the capacity to make something unexpected. We can act in a way that is not according to the laws of nature. We are not bound to act in a particular way. So this is why thinking is such an important activity for Arendt, if you remember from the previous lecture or talk. So if you remember, thinking for Arendt is only ruled by its own categories. They are not decided by the experiences, the current experiences. Thinking is not governed by our experience, but instead gives our experience meaning. So this is why thinking is to act. Thinking is one example of our human exercise of freedom, that is, of imagining things anew in a different way. another important concept, and very interesting here from a theological perspective, is that forgiveness is perhaps the prime example of acting and starting something new for Arendt. Because what forgiveness does is to enable a new relation between the victim and the perpetrator. Arendt doesn't write terribly much about forgiveness, but it's a central concept of what activity, a genuine activity of starting something new, is in Arendt. So she gives a very interesting example here of what the political might mean in terms of freedom and space and activity. She gives the example of the ordinary table. Because what you need in order to act is, of course, space. And in a very real sense, with no space, you cannot move. And also you need space to allow to express yourself and so on. But to come back to the table, the common world, as Arendt sees it, is the people joined together by a table. The table in itself is that which unites distinct individuals into community. So the table makes you into a community. You share the table. At the same time, just as obviously, the table separates people from each other. It gives them space. And she writes in the book Human Condition, as the table is located between those who sit around it, the world, like every in-between, relates and separates men at the same time. So for freedom to be possible, one needs to be able to move. Movement here should be understood as movement in thought as well as in activity. Movement of the mind and the body. Without movement, there can be no freedom. And what is needed for movement is, of course, space. And this is just to say something of Judith Butler that you will hear something about in the next lecture. She really explores the idea of what space means in order for political action and activity. How we even are constituted beforehand by the space where we find ourselves. So this is a link between Butler and Arendt, where Arendt doesn't really develop it in the same way as Butler, but still there's a very communalities here between Hannah Arendt and Judith Butler. So anyway, humans need to find common space in order to uphold the human world. And space is needed for freedom, since freedom necessitates movement. So this is why totalitarianism is another way of destroying the political for Hannah Arendt. Of course, totalitarianism is the lack of freedom, but what is central for Arendt is that totalitarianism controls one's space, and the lack of freedom enters all the way into the individual herself for Arendt. In a totalitarian society, as Arendt describes it in Origins of Totalitarianism, the individual becomes afraid of thinking even, which you found in Eichmann, or she argues happened in Eichmann. One could be betrayed at every single instance, at home, in the private, at the marketplace, in the public, workplace, or bus. So one in the end becomes afraid of even thinking. So all human activity that enables freedom, including thinking, is restricted in the totalitarian society. One wonders, of course, what Arendt would say about thinking in a consumerist society, even though it's, of course, not a totalitarian society in Arendt's way of seeing it in terms of Nazi Germany and Soviet Union, or Stalin's Soviet Union. But anyway, what does the freedom to think mean when in a consumerist society with commercial and so on, and strong big data and digitalized in a digitalized world and the influence from that? But that's a different question as well. So freedom, you need to be able to act anew in order to have freedom. That's the definition of freedom for Arendt. So with this, having said this, the concept of acting anew, the nativity, the concept of freedom, of coming together to act according to the common good. And as we see here, Arendt picks up Aristotle's idea of a common good. Acting in concert is the idea of power rather than conflict, as I know mentioned in Schmitt. So in that way, Arendt is close to Schmitt in his and Arendt's idea of the world. You enter into the world and you get your identity only when you enter into the common world. There's the communality between Arendt and Schmitt. But Arendt takes on Aristotle's idea when it comes to acting in concert and the common good, where she moves away or is distinct from Carl Schmitt's idea of enmity as a central role in politics. So I hope now that this has given a sort of clearer picture of Arendt's concept of the political and how it's connected with a whole bunch of other central concepts in Arendt's thinking, such as plurality, the world, freedom, power, action, and nativity. So I hope with this that you enter and are able to understand Arendt's writings about Kant and the political philosophy of Kant and judging in your reading.